Can start up again. I wanted to say that I think this is my third year here. I come, I guess, generally every other year. I believe this is my third year. I'm not really sure, which says something about my memory, but I'm pretty sure. I taught Benjamin's Critique of Violence one year. The second time I focused on Hannah Arendt's work. And then this time I'm focusing on Kafka with some Benjamin and company. And I'm glad to be here. I know that some professors come here and they teach their own theory, right? This is what Butler says or believes or whatever. And I don't teach my own theory in that sense. And I mean, I don't do that at the University of California, Berkeley, and I've actually never really done that. Although I have on occasion when I give public talks answered questions about my own theory and what I mean by various concepts or what I'm working on and the rest. One of my great pleasures in life is teaching both philosophy and literature and thinking about the relationship between the two. And as you may know, there are various approaches to this particular topic. There are those who look to literary texts to find examples of moral characters, right? Characters that have certain kinds of moral value or that comport themselves in a way that's understood to have moral significance, and they take those characters from a novel or from a short story generally, and try to build a theory of virtue or a theory of moral practice or a theory of character on the basis of that. I think there are others who look at literature as a reserve of existential themes. So many undergraduate courses, for instance, tend to, in philosophy, tend to look at literature as exemplifying the problem of death or exemplifying the problem of justice or some such. And in those cases, and actually in both of those cases, the literary is offered as a kind of example or illustration of a prior philosophical point. But the philosophical point doesn't necessarily need the literary for its articulation, but it gets made more colorful and more concrete by virtue of the literary instance. It seems to me that there are certain kinds of philosophical issues that are themselves interrogated by literary forms. And I know that that's a problematic formulation for many reasons, but I think that most philosophy works through propositional claims or through argumentative structures. And though there are philosophical traditions that work with essay forms or that even work with shorter, more abbreviated forms, it is more often than not the case that there will always be philosophers who seek to translate out of the literary form into the propositional claim or the sequential argument in order to make the literary work or the more literary essay properly philosophical. Okay. Now, for those of you who've read Derrida or de Man or have considered closely the work of Kierkegaard or Wittgenstein or Benjamin, you will know that literary forms are important for the articulation of the philosophical, and that the philosophical cannot be so easily extracted or generalized from the literary form, and sometimes, in fact, what is being explored philosophically produces a crisis for the propositional form. Certainly Hegel thought that. His idea of the speculative sentence, for instance, is a sentence that you have to read in two different directions at the same time. So you can't just read it sequentially. You can't just read subject is substance and think you've got it, because substance is also subject, and it's working in both directions at the same time. How do you come up with a form of articulation that would make the speculative sentence possible? Jean-Luc Nancy wrote an early and very important book on la remarque spéculative, the speculative sentence in English, which talks about the vexed temporality of that writing. But of course, as soon as philosophical writing starts to question the adequacy of the propositional form, or the adequacy of argumentative structure, or clear designation, concise conceptualization, then it tends to risk its prestigious philosophy, at least in the Anglo-analytic worlds of philosophy, and increasingly throughout the European Union, Australia, and other places where philosophy departments have become more or less subject to the same set of disciplinary norms. So one of the reasons I'm doing this here is that I want you to see not just that there's a literary text and then there's a theory we might derive from it or apply to it. I think it would be a mistake to approach theory as a technical application. We can't take a pre-given theory, a pre-established theory, and see, okay, how do I apply this to this particular text? You can do it. You can even pass a course that way. You can even probably get an approved dissertation with that method. You might even get a publication, and you might even get a job. So it's not that it cannot be done, okay? But I want to caution against it, because one of the things it does is it invokes an instrumental logic. Right? Philosophy is the higher mode. It's the instrument we use. Literature is our material. We apply the one to the other. We come out with something we call an interpretation. I'm not sure one could really call it a reading, but one could.
This to me is extremely interesting. This is exactly something that I'm working on.
But you want me to turn to Kafka?
No. Oh, if you want.
No, I'm just kidding. You'll get used to me.
Okay. I was just curious to find out if, I recall there was a video with you and Zizek in a discussion. And you were talking about how we have to come to a different understanding of logic or go beyond what we typically,
yes,
how we typically think about it. I was wondering if this idea is sort of like, is this something like you're working on, or is this something like, and is this a response to that?
No, not quite. I mean, look, I want to say something ironic here, but not disrespectful. I want to say, well, maybe this problem is working on me. You know, maybe this problem works on me or through me, or maybe we're all in the midst of working this problem. But certainly, I mean, Zizek and I both come from certain readings of Hegel that would make it important to question both propositional logics and certain ideas of what philosophical prose has to be. There's no question about that. I think for me, the idea of logic is not so primary. I don't start with a problem of logic. I invariably start with a problem of language, and maybe that's partly my post-structuralism, but maybe it's also partly the fact that I entered the U.S. I entered philosophy through studying in Germany, Hegel, Kant, etc., but also through Wittgenstein and Kierkegaard and those kinds of writing. So that became very interesting to me. But the one thing I would say, I would presume that Zizek would probably agree on this as well, is that sometimes I think philosophy is conducted in literary form, and Nietzsche. I mean Nietzsche, Thus Spake Zarathustra, even the genealogy of morals, Ecce Homo. It's just his parables. He has several parables throughout Zarathustra. How do we read them? I mean, there are philosophers who will extract the propositional form and make it lucid and believe that they've done the world a service by taking a confused text or one that is not able to present itself in a clear, concise, perspicacious way and give it a clear, concise, and perspicacious, blah. And I'm in favor of lucidity. Don't get me wrong. I stay up all night long fearing the loss of my lucidity. So it's not as if I don't want lucidity. I do. But I think there are quarrels, and there are contests over what counts as lucid and what we can expect from lucidity. And even quarrels about certain forms of lucidity instituting forms of opacity that are sometimes problematic, and other quarrels about what can be adequately transcribed into conceptual definitions and what cannot, what resists that. And we found a couple of instances this morning offered by these texts of instances that, at least in the language of the text, were said to resist a certain kind of fixed conceptualization. So my wager is the following, that when Kafka was writing in the 10s and 20s, the first couple of decades of the 20th century, he was certainly drawing on many traditions and working out many different kinds of problems. But among them were questions about progressive history, whether history is progressive, whether some idea of freedom or idea of justice or some idea could be realized through history. Okay, there were thinkers he read, for instance, from the Marburg School, including get back there, who did believe in reason in history, who thought that reason could be extrapolated in history. He was also exposed to a fair number of debates about Judaism and Jewishness and Zionism and what could be realized in history. And he went to those meetings and was very often bewildered by the terms of the debates. Very hard to make him into an ideological figure for one position or another, because he was mainly conflicted about many. But many issues of these kinds did concern him, and I think registered in the writing, so that by the time Adorno and Scholem and Benjamin were reading Kafka and trying to offer their interpretations, Hannah Arendt as well, there's something at stake in how best to read Kafka. Okay, there's something very importantly at stake. And Adorno at one point said that he thought Kafka showed us that we could try to interpret or decode the world, but the key that would unlock the code had been unfortunately thrown away. And there are places in Kafka where this kind of palimpsest occurs. For instance, if in the penal colony, there's the commandant is supposed to brings out a map, and the map is supposed to show how this this apparatus works, and what the instructions are. The apparatus is supposed to write on the body a kind of final judgment. It's supposed to be readable. But in fact, when the map comes out, it turns out that many people have written over it over time to the point that it's such a palimpsest with one sort of writing overlaying the next that you can't actually read it anymore, right? That it becomes illegible and unworkable. So the directions that we might need to see how judgment works or how a final judgment might work, they're there, but they're no longer readable, which suggests something very odd, which is that a certain kind of remnant of a past, a kind of archaic formulation still operates and still even has its hold on those who are operating in a time that is characterized precisely by the loss of the key or the unreadability of the text. It's not a nihilistic position, what I just suggested to you. It seems to me to be a position that is trying to grapple with an historical time or an experience of time and space, perhaps, that is no longer organized legibly by progress or redemption. Okay, just in the most kind of simple way. And I tried to show this morning a little bit about how some of these ideas are going somewhere, called into question, a temporal sequence that moves over a spatial continuum, or that suggests that the place at issue might be a locatable place that a body could actually occupy. And I suggested as well that there seems to be a theological problematic. Now, when I say theological, I don't mean that Kafka's getting engaged in theological debates about the existence of God. Nor do I mean to say that what is theological is completely separate from what is historical, given how certain eschatological ideas of realization have been so important to Marxist historiography, right? The slow, inevitable, or not so inevitable realization of an ideal through time. The eventual coming of the Messiah, which either breaks through an historical experience or comes through an historical experience. Right. So both strands, we might say, are important to hold in mind together. Like the guy in Before the Law, which I think we'll read tomorrow afternoon, with Avital. The guy in Before the Law, he can't move through the gates. He can't move. He's waiting for permission to move through the door that the doorkeeper guards in order to enter the law. Right? He wants access to the law. He's waiting to enter. He doesn't pass through that door. In the same way, in My Destination, our so-called master doesn't exactly pass through the gates, at least not within the linguistic confines of the parable that we have. We can speculate, if he were passing through the gates, would he be passing through the gates of heaven? Would he be leaving this world for another world? And in some ways, the idea of the gates and passing on to a place that is no place certainly invokes that for us. So it's invoked in a way, although what happens to that? We have to ask, what happens to that invocation? We can ask the question, is he going to another place? Is he going to a heaven? Is he going to another world? Is he entering into a transcendent domain? But we have no way of answering it. So what we're left with is something like the question without an answer. Since the parable doesn't offer us the evidence we need to answer the question, So in some ways, to read the parable is to undergo a certain kind of constraint on speculation. Right? We undergo the constraint on speculation. We feel its pull. We also feel its impasse. We come up against its impasse. That doesn't keep us from wanting to speculate. In fact, it seems to me many of us had some fine speculations this morning and probably enjoyed ourselves a great deal in our speculations. But I'm not sure we could settle any of them in definitive form. And I want to suggest to you that as much as the parable incites speculation, it also quells or stops it. So we know the lure of that speculation, and we also experience the constraint or the limit on speculation. We may find ourselves racking our brains against a set of constraints that seem to thwart our efforts at conclusion. So the impossible, and I would suggest hilarious, Weg von hier. I mean, come on, this is a very good joke. We could all rack our brains against it for a very long time. It might be understood simply as a kind of grammatical assault on space and time. It's as far as we can get. You're trying to get to heaven, trying to get to the next world. Well, here, you can have this grammatical assault on space and time, but that's probably as far as you're going to get. It's a failed assault performed by the parable in a certain way. So what opens up by such, what is opened up by such linguistic gestures is what I tried to suggest that they might be, linguistic gestures. And one thing that opens up is a sense of the incommensurability between what is expected or anticipated or a speculation that is in some ways incited, and a limit on knowability that is also asserted. Now, in a way, I want to suggest that the linguistic hilarity of the coinage, Weg von hier, is part of what we're left with. And I think it's probably important to consider the way in which laughter emerges in the course of reading Kafka. It's extremely important. There's certain texts that he read where he laughed the entire time. And of course, many people say Kafka's gloomy and pessimistic, if not nihilistic. But I want to suggest that we're actually confronted with a more complex, even playful relation to the idea of coming up against the constraints on intelligibility. It's not a playfulness that necessarily belongs to a personality, although maybe it did, but it is a playfulness that's born out in language. And I believe Larry Rickles will come tomorrow afternoon and talk to us a little bit about the judgment, which I'm going to have circulated to all of you. And it might be interesting for you to know that that's a story that Kafka laughed through as he read it aloud to his friends.
Yeah. I have a particular question. It's very pertinent a few lines back, so I don't want to get you off track if you want to ask me a little bit later. But okay, so beginning by making the distinction between, I've got to make a quick distinction first. Foucault makes a distinction between the statement and the proposition, right? Getting back to what we were originally talking about.
Mm-hmm.
He makes a distinction between the statement, the proposition, the sentence, and the speech act. But ultimately, what I'm interested in is the distinction between the statement and the proposition. Now, if we think about history in terms of the unfolding of different discourses, perpetually appropriating each other's objects, and so on and so forth, if we think about the propositional form as sort of emerging, descending, and appropriating the possibilities of the statement, could we think about what Kafka is doing in terms of the parable as sort of like an ethical response to trying to reopen the statement?
Well, let's just go back a little bit because you see Foucault's working within another set of very interesting and important concepts, but he's deriving them mainly from structuralism and from Benveniste. And that's a fine thing to do. It's a great tradition. But in my slightly polemical introduction, I'm using the idea of proposition as it's been developed within certain forms of philosophy of language in the US British context. And it would take us a long time to figure that out. But the short answer to your question is that I don't think the idea of the statement is enough to cover, say, the linguistic complexity of a parable. Like if we were to say, oh, this parable could be understood as a statement. I don't think so. Not even in the Foucauldian sense. Not even, because it involves, and most of Kafka's writings involve instances of performative utterances in the form of commands that fail to be illocutionary. That is to say, they fail to bring about to bring into being that which they name, and they even fail as perlocutionary. They fail to bring about the consequences they're supposed to bring about. So we have a kind of suffering of the performative that happens, I think, throughout his work. And there are statements that are made all over the place, and indeed many questions about what is obvious or what is evidence. But without an understanding of irony, right, we wouldn't be able to see a statement as both stating something and undercutting that statement at the same time. And without seeing how certain kinds of sentences function in relationship to one another, we wouldn't be able to see what the broader constellation is that they're trying to bring forward.
Okay, but more so in the distinction between the proposition, it's not so much getting back to the statement, it's more so opening the proposition, that I'm thinking that is like sort of almost mode of, I don't want to say limit experience, but like sort of opening boundaries of the possible. Like if the proposition sort of can be understood to have, maybe closed off way that language can open itself, could you not see it as ultimately in the critique of language? Can't you see it as sort of like a reaction to that? I don't know. I don't think I'm saying it very clearly.
Well, possibly.
Like a strategy almost.
Maybe so. But I'm afraid that would then take us down another road.
Oh.
And it's an interesting road, and I hear some Heideggerian resonances in your rendition of Foucault, and it may well be possible to link them in an interesting way. But it's just one of those moments where I'm made a little nervous by bringing that framework to bear on this, because we're still building up, right? And I'm doing this somewhat slow and hopefully not tedious thing by trying to read these with you. But Benjamin did, and Adorno did, and Arendt did, and Derrida did. They read them really slowly. I don't know if Agamben did. It would be interesting to ask him. I sometimes think he's missing something about the Messianic by not focusing more closely on Kafka, although he has done some work on Kafka, to be sure. But we can talk about that later, to be sure. All right, so let me just, if I may, go a little bit further, because I want us to turn to the coming of the Messiah, which I feel like, we have to arrive. We must arrive at the coming of the Messiah. How terrible if we don't arrive. And look, what I'm putting forward is a sketch of an understanding that I'm working on and revising. And one of the great things for me about doing this in seminar form, when it's not work that I've finished or I'm done with, is I get to think along with you. So if you have that sneaking suspicion that, oh, I'm trying to impose something on you, or I'm reluctant to alternative readings, you should think twice. I'm actually, this is pretty raw for me, and I actually don't have great, I don't have great investments in mastery about this material at this moment. I might someday, but you're catching me at a moment where I don't have it, and I'm glad not to have it. And I know that there's a lot of mastery stuff that goes along around here, a lot of ethos of mastery. But I've agreed to come this year on the presumption that I can mess with that a little bit. Okay, so what do I want to say? Okay, the text, the coming of the Messiah, is a complicated one, and in the German it is das Kommen, the coming. It's not the Ankunft. It's not the arrival. Okay, it's not the arrival. It's not the fact of arrival. It's the coming. One question I would ask about it is whether something does arrive in the parable, and when I ask that question, I'm asking at least two different questions. Can we locate something that arrives in the terms of the parable, but also does it arrive for us? Does the meaning of the parable arrive? Is there a Messiah here who arrives? Let's take a look at it, because I think that it will...
It's page 81.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's one of those parables where, well, the expectation is there. It's not really there in the title. The title produces it in some way. It opens the question right away. Okay, does someone want to read this for us?
I can read it.
Mike.
The coming of the Messiah. The Messiah will come as soon as the most unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible. When there is no one to destroy this possibility and no one to suffer its destruction. Hence, the graves will open themselves. This, perhaps, is Christian doctrine too, applying as much to the actual presentation of the example to be emulated, which is an individualistic example, as to the symbolic presentation of the resurrection of the mediator in a single individual. The Messiah will come only when he is no longer necessary. He will come only on the day after his arrival. He will come not on the last day, but on the very last.
How reassuring. All right, does someone want to start us off with the first couple of lines? What do you want to take a look at that and see what you see? There are probably a couple of things to be aware of in relation to the German. The Messiah will come as soon as the most unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible. Unbridled, zügelloseste, difficult word. which tends to be used, unbridled is a good translation, I think, but it's when you let yourself go. I think some people have said it can even have a sexual connotation, unbridled, unleashed. So the most unleashed or unconstrained individualism of faith becomes possible. So we're going to have to figure out what an individualism of faith might mean. And then, of course, there's odd punctuation. There's a dash and a comma, which is odd, at least in the German. But in the English, it's a dash. When there is no one to destroy this possibility and no one to suffer its destruction. Okay, so when will the Messiah come? Well, the Messiah will come as soon as the most unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible. Well, what kind of time is that? What kind of condition is that? Well, it is one when there is no one to destroy this possibility and no one to suffer its destruction. Niemand. Niemand. No one, no one. It seems that this would be a time when there is no one around, right? When there is no one. Which would be odd to think of that as the most unbridled individualism of faith. It's as if the unleashing of the individualism of faith would somehow lead to or be consonant with the negation or eradication of all individuals. Or at least that paradox is introduced, I think, by those first two sentences. And then a line, hence the graves will open themselves. You may know this is actually a phrase from St. Matthew in the New Testament. But in this parable, it's clear that there is no one who will open the graves will open themselves. And this is already quite hard. It's already quite difficult. If the Messiah will come when the most unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible, and if the unbridling of individualism is one in which there's no one to destroy this possibility, the possibility of the Messiah's coming, and no one to suffer its destruction, Messianic destruction of some kind, perhaps, then the Messiah will come when no one is around.
Could it be also, or when no one is together?
When no one is together?
Yeah.
Tell me what you mean.
Well, if it's the most unbridled individualism of faith, then to me that suggests sort of a necessity for a remote path, or a solitary path.
Yeah. Well, that's possible, but could it also be that an individualism of faith is a faith that an individual will embody the Messianic, that the Messiah will take the form of an individual? And could it also be that these opening lines are saying, actually, the Messiah will come once individualism is vanquished, and no individual...
It's a temporal concept.
Well, you're going to have to ask that.
It is. Well, not that it is, but it is one suggestion that it is a temporal.
That it's a temporal concept. That the Messiah is a temporal concept. Okay. Let's hold that in mind. I think that's an important suggestion, and I think it becomes most important in the second part. But is there some way? Let's at least hold in mind the idea that if there's no one, then the unleashing of of individualism might also be something like its dissolution. Or even the letting go of individualism. Hence the graves will open themselves, there's no one around to do that. This perhaps, I love the perhaps, das ist vielleicht, this perhaps is Christian doctrine too, applying as much to the actual presentation of the example to be emulated. Okay. Which is an individualistic example, right? Christian doctrine too, he's speculating, whoever is speaking, we don't know who's speaking. This perhaps is Christian doctrine too, applying as much to the actual presentation of the example to be emulated, the example of the one who is to be emulated, which is an individualistic example, right? Christ is an individual who is one we are supposed to emulate and who is the individual embodiment of the Messiah. And then further, as it applies to this as to, because it sort of applies to two different things, perhaps. First, individualistic example we're supposed to emulate. Secondly, to the symbolic presentation of the resurrection of the mediator in the single individual. The symbolic presentation of the resurrection of the mediator in the single individual. Now this is, of course, I think, a little Hegelian joke. No, I mean, he's actually bungling together kind of Christian and Hegelian rhetoric. Like the mediator, I suppose in the early Hegel you could find the idea that Christ is the mediator, because mediation is a really fundamental Hegelian concept. But it's not the usual way of thinking about Christ, but it seems to be that here, in language that parallels the complexity of Hegel's or idealist philosophy's language, the parable is suggesting the idea of Christ as a mediator or a single individual. It doesn't have to be Christ. It's the single individual as consisting of the resurrection of the mediator. Okay. Now, I would just say that it's nearly impossible to follow, right? And as you read this, don't think, oh, I'm just stupid, I can't get this. It's not the problem. Right? That's not the problem. It is intensely dense, and it's drawing on a couple of different very very complex Christological and Hegelian traditions to make a very tortured sentence, and the tortured status of the sentence is important for us here. Something's being tortured. Okay, a sentence is being tortured. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I would like to ask, when you say when it is written, it is a Christian doctrine too.
Yes.
It's also Hegelian?
Well, this is a very important question, no? To say this perhaps is Christian doctrine too?
Yeah.
I mean, I read it as a kind of Jewish joke, right? It's like, well, this
because
is...
you said Christologic, and I see what interest
now we
you
get
show
it.
them in it. I mean, I see the Kabbalistic...
Sholem comes a little later.
No, but, okay, but...
Yeah. But true, but the Kabbalistic he is exposed to in the 1910s, so it's very possible. But yes, but you want us to move ahead so quickly.
Sorry.
Well, go ahead. Why don't you finish the reading and see?
One with better English should
No, your English is fine. Your English is fine. But you're absolutely right. Saying this perhaps is Christian doctrine too suggests, first of all, it seems more evidently to be a non-Christian doctrine, and the coming of the Messiah seems to be what the Jews continue to believe in, not having accepted Christ as Messiah. But then the perhaps, I think, is also kind of great, because it also suggests, I don't really know that much about Christianity, or maybe that's Christian, like if anyone can fathom it. And then the very next tortured sentence is a kind of like tortured version of Christian principle, right? Which doesn't hold together logically, but becomes kind of piled on. Yes, please.
I'm kind of struggling with this because it says the part where he's like, he'll come only on the day after his arrival, but if you do believe in Christian doctrine, then he's already come.
Yes.
And thinking of the Messiah as a temporal concept, thinking of Agamemnon's writings on Messiah, on Messianism, and also on this play of Hegel and Christianity, like all the work done by Zizek recently in The Monstrosity of Christ is a Hegelian reading of Christianity, just all like confounds this. Because, I don't know, the first line even, it says, when the individualism of faith becomes possible, like it's not possible already, but I don't know, I think there is an individualism of faith possible.
Well, I guess we would have to decide what the unbridled individualism is, right? And how that distinguishes, and what that Zügelloseste actually does here. And if it is unbridled, what does that mean for individualism? So that's one thing. But let's just note this for now, okay? Just as a way of proceeding. We have this first sentence. The Messiah will come, and then there are conditions under which the Messiah will come. And the first one is unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible, and apparently it's not yet possible, or at least that's within the writing here. It's presumed not yet to be possible, and much hangs on the distinction between individualism of faith, how we understand that, and unbridled individualism of faith. Hence, the graves will open themselves. Why hence? We might ask, why hence? Also, like, as a result, or therefore.
Thus. Does
Sorry?
it also mean thus?
It can be thus, but thus it's like it suggests a logical or temporal link of some kind. And then, of course, we have this moment of doubt. This perhaps is Christian doctrine, too, suggesting that what we've just read is perhaps Jewish doctrine, most obviously, and some doubt about what Christian doctrine actually is, and then applying as much to A as to B, and then we get A, actual presentation of the example to be emulated, the idea of the Messiah as an actual presentation to be emulated, and that's individualistic, as to the symbolic presentation of the resurrection of the mediator in the single individual. Okay, so then we have two examples. What are those examples about? Well, this perhaps is Christian doctrine too, applying as much to the one as to the other. Well, what's the this which is Christian doctrine too?
Is it not referring to Christ?
It is referring to Christ. I'm sure it's referring to
As
Christ.
the actual presentation within Christian doctrine.
But let's remember that the first line is a line that's telling us when the Messiah will come. So, could it be the case that the Messiah will come only when these two individualist examples that he gives, two different versions of Christ, actually overcome their individualist presumption, when the individualism is let loose or becomes unbridled such that no one is there to destroy the possibility and no one is there to suffer it. In other words, the Messiah will come when no one is there. The Messiah will come when the Messiah ceases to be understood as an individual. In other words, the Messiah will come when Christ is no longer standing in for the Messiah. In that sense, a very strong Jewish claim. Right? Christ was not the Messiah. No individual could be the Messiah. some Jews would disagree with that. They think some individuals can be the Messiah, but they haven't yet come, or that they did come, but we misrecognized them. Well, it's too late now. Okay, but let's at least go with this idea. That's that this unbridled individualism, the one that lets loose of its own individualism, is the one that would allow the Messiah to, it would only be in that time when there is no individualism, when there's no individual, that the Messiah will come. Let's read that in light of the next paragraph, and we have to ask, why the graphic shift between the first and the second paragraph. Yes.
And it seems to be talking, again, could we read it as, one example is the actual presentation, and the other is the symbolic presentation.
That's true, thank you. That's right.
So then, I wonder if it's the problem of the parable and real again, or reality.
Well, but what he's saying here, at least, or what the parable is saying, is that this perhaps Christian doctrine, which has just been articulated, I don't know what makes it Christian, if it is Christian, this dubiously Christian doctrine that's just been articulated, applies as much to the one as to the other, as much to the actual as to the symbolic. So whether we interpret Christ as an actually existing individual, or as a symbolic mediation, it would seem that neither of these would be sufficient, or both of them would have to be overcome, since both of them seem to be individualistic examples, or to rely on a single kind of figure.
But that seems to be a contradiction with the first line, right?
Tell me why.
I don't know, because there's this attempt to overcome individualism in the Messiah figure, as looking at the Messiah as an individual. But in doing that, it seems like an individualism of faith would be embracing of faith individually by particular people, not as like a community. Like I just don't know what they mean here by individualism of faith.
Good.
It seems so just ambiguous and problematic.
It's true. But one thing we do know, working back from, let's say, just from within the first paragraph, there are two examples that are given. The actual presentation is an individualistic example. The symbolic presentation is of the resurrection of the mediator in the single individual. Right? So both of them center on the individual. If it's Christian doctrine that the Messiah will only come as soon as the most unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible, when there's no one to destroy the possibility and no one to suffer it, then it would seem that the unbridling of individualism is the destruction of the individual, which means that those two examples would also be destroyed, because they're still individual examples. They still are within the framework of individualism. So what we have to, I think, assume is that the unbridled or unleashed individualism is one in which individualism is itself overcome, it's dissolved. I guess the English word I would use would be, in some sense, dissolved. Yes?
Relative to that, I wanted to ask a semantical question. When he writes individualism of faith, are we bound to take that in the sense that the individualism is made up within faith? In other words, like a house of stone? Or is it some characteristic within faith, like the density of stone.
I see. Well, as far as I read the German, and someone else could help here, the Individualismus des Glaubens is an individualism that faith possesses. It belongs to faith. Okay, so there's a certain form of individualism that belongs to faith. And when that individualism becomes zugelustete, when it becomes unbridled, unleashed, it's interesting. It might also be unbridled, unleashed, set free of its constraints, right? Set free of its constraints. It seems that the Messiah can then come, suggesting that individualism is itself constraining or constrained, or constrained, and that once unconstrained, it dissolves or it is let loose in some way, and then the Messiah will come. And the Messiah will come only then, once the individualism of faith is unconstrained or set free from its constraint. This perhaps is Christian doctrine too. In other words, Christian doctrine was maybe always Jewish doctrine, applying to either the belief in Christ as the existing individual or the belief in Christ as the mediator and symbolic presentation. Which means that the Messiah will come only after the individual example is overcome.
That makes sense, and this seems to suggest that the Messiah still has not come, or that will only come after when it is no longer necessary. You could argue, though, that given that individualism has already been set free and unconstrained when God is dead now, God has died on the cross,
I don't know.
We have the Holy Spirit of the community.
It's not here.
I don't know if God is dead. Is God dead here?
In the text.
I don't know if God is dead here. You know, it would be interesting to know whether God is dead here. It's a very good question to ask, whether God is dead here. I have my suspicions. But given what we're dealing with. But let's note just two things. That both of these paragraphs begin with a declaration about what will happen in the future. So, der Messias wird kommen, will come. This is a prediction. Someone's exercising the rhetorical power of prediction, right? And then again, der Messias wird, and then in the second one, wird erst kommen. The Messiah will come only. But you could also say, will first come, which means he hasn't come before. Der Messiah wird erst kommen. He'll come for the first time. Okay, so this is now a strong anti-Christological move. The Messiah will come only when he's no longer necessary, wenn nicht mehr nötig sein wird. It's no longer necessary. It's no longer needed. Nötig. Notwendig is necessary. Nötig is also necessary, urgent, needed. He will come only on the day after his arrival. If it erst, again, he will come for the first time. I want to hold that erst in place there. He will come for the first time. For the first time. Einen Tag nach seiner Ankunft kommen. He will not come. He will come not on the last day, but on the very last, okay? And so again, drawing on the idea of messianic destruction, no one will be there to be destroyed by this possibility, messianic destruction, which is very important for Benjamin as well, in the Critique of Violence. What's happening with this second paragraph? So here's a prediction when he will first come. Well, the first paragraph seems to be telling us that he will only come when there are no individuals around him, when he himself is not regarded as an individual.
Well,
Go
it
ahead.
seems in the first paragraph to perhaps simplify it too much, but just to think about it. In the first paragraph, you have the death of the individual. In the second paragraph, you almost have the death of the Messiah, him or herself, in the sense that it is when he is no longer necessary that... I mean, death might be too strong of a word, but do you know where I'm going with that?
Well, I don't know if a Messiah is unnecessary. What Messiahs do generally, if we ask, what are Messiahs for? Because they redeem, they resurrect, they lead, they destroy. They're required by those who want redemption of some kind. But it seems like all the folks who are waiting they're not there, since the graves are opening themselves and no one's around to suffer the destruction or the possibility. So it strikes me that he's not needed by others. Now there are theologies where God does die if he's not needed, like Heschel. Heschel has this point of view. Edmund Jabez has this point of view, that God does, when the God is no longer needed, God dies, right? And that's a dynamic interrelation between sort of human need and divine existence. But I'm not seeing that might be an overreading here.
Okay.
God, in fact, hasn't even entered the scene. One wonders. Yes.
It seems from your comments earlier, not so much just about 2 paragraphs ago,
Yes.
where you come talking to the second paragraph with a conclusion that's more Jewish. It seems to me that you suggested there's a conflation between something Hegelian and Christological, but in overall there was a suggestion that there's a conflation between the Christian and the Jewish view. I have a different reading. I think this is a purely Jewish view, which is why he concludes the way he does. And I take it right back to the very beginning. I think that in using the word unbridled, and I'm on shaky ground here because I do not know the resonances in German.
Yeah, it's
I mean, unbridled could be unfettered in a positive sense, but also out of control in a negative sense. If we take the second suggestion, out of an uncontrolled individualism, it is a profoundly Jewish critique, in the sense that the Christians have individualized, in the jargon of certain fundamentalists, not to put it down, but to understand their eschatology, they personalize Jesus. It's their personal savior. And I think this is exactly not Jewish. This is precisely not Jewish. So I see it as a very Jewish statement, understanding him in the bath of the world he lived in, which was in a circle Jewish, but ensconced in a larger Christian culture. So I see him as a joke, if you will, a joke at the Christian society's, larger society's expense about this unbridled individualism that leads to this personal God, this Messiah, this Savior, who, by the way, will never come. So if I
Well, that's not quite true. He's coming, only not on the last day, but
not in a useful way, as the Christians would have it.
Well, he's no longer needed. That's
Right.
true. There's no great use for him. But that's not to say that he's not coming.
Yes, but not when we need him.
True. True enough. Okay, a good point. It could also be that he's playing on the idea of what is Judeo-Christian, that is to say, what is the Judaic foundation of Christianity, which comes to trouble the individualism of faith, that is to say, the form of individualism that belongs to faith. And once we release that individualism from faith, maybe then we get some possibility of a Messiah coming who is not understood to be an individual. But he's not just understood not to be an individual. He comes without arriving, and he does not come on the last day. So we need to know, A, what does it mean to come without arriving? Hello?
But there's something hidden. There's a suggestion of something hidden.
Yes, that's for sure.
Can I have another nuance? You mentioned the Gamben.
Yes, well, I understand he's always in the air, so go ahead.
Okay, well, he did this little book called La Chiesa e il Regno, the Church and the Reign, in which he invokes Benjamin in a way that I think is exactly opposite, but opposite as well to this text. He says this about Benjamin. Benjamin, who had heard the lesson of Paul perfectly, repeats it in this way. Every day, this is a quote from Benjamin. Every day, every instant is the little gateway through which the Messiah arrives. That's exactly the opposite of this notion that the Messiah will come when he's not necessary. So in the Christian view, the Messiah is always arriving. In this view, in his construction of the Jewish view, which is my reading, the Messiah almost never arrives, but if he does, it's when we don't need him anymore.
Not quite, because we still haven't figured out the difference between coming and arriving. Okay? So in order to accept your interesting thesis, and I thank you for it, we have to know first the difference between coming and arriving, and we have to understand the distinction between the last day and the allerletzten, the very last. Okay? I have some ideas about it, but I actually would love to hear you. And I need to kind of... That's Vincenzo, and this is Ryan, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if the point you just made about him kind of playing on the Judeo-Christian
Yes.
kind of linkage in terms of both having a Messiah figure but having maybe slightly different interpretations of it, maybe that's why he plays this little Hegelian joke about mediation in the middle.
Interesting.
Okay, and why would that be? I'm sorry?
Just because maybe he's trying to invoke a sort of, with this parable, a sort of mediation between the Jewish foundation of Messianism and the Christian reading of Messianism.
I see. Well, there does seem to be kind of odd coupling at the beginning, at least, although
Towards the end.
Vincenzo is making us is actually suggesting that it's a Jewish repudiation of the Christian individualizing of the Messiah. So we're gonna keep these possibilities in circulation. Yeah.
I just want to throw out a few random thoughts relative to these points. First one is that it seems to me, maybe it's oversimplifying it, but the mediator being capitalized there refers directly to the symbolic figure of Christ in Christian theology, as the stand-in in between the Messiah, maybe you can call it true Messiah, and what Christ stands for in theology. At least it seems like that, and I don't know if he would try to elevate Hegel to draw an analogy like that. Also, it's clear in the second paragraph that the time is distorted, right? And it draws me back to, time is distorted, but I personally don't want to confuse necessary with needed. And I wonder in the German what meaning comes more directly,
With
necessity or desire or something,
Well, it depends on how it's used. I mean, I would say technically nötig is necessary, but it's not logical necessity, which is Notwendigkeit. But if you offer somebody something and they say, yeah, this is nicht nötig, it's not needed, it's not necessary for what I'm doing. But it's not, there's separate language for need, Bedürfnis. So, I don't know. Does a German speaker want to enter here?
I think it's the same ambiguity. I mean, with Notwendigkeit, it's more this, it goes back to the emergency of applying it, so it's a necessity to have it. But with the nötig, I think it's kind of ambiguous relationship.
Could I make one final
Please.
Observation? Because with the unbridled individualism, the bridling that we were referring to, fettering, tethering, leashing, all these things, they refer to animals, right? So I think that there's a sort of animism being evoked in the individualism and of faith. So it becomes kind of maybe personified, but certainly given the characteristics of an animal being.
Is that resonance there in the German?
The problem is that the word for bridle or leash isn't there. You know, but I don't mind this at all. But the thing about zugelöst is, it is the hardest word for me. Okay, and maybe those of you who are a little bit much more native than me can work with it. Yeah.
I'm just a little confused, and maybe I don't have my Christian history really correct, but what I'm reading here is the Messiah came before Christianity was born, in a way. So because you said that it may be a Judaic reading of Christianity, so that the Messiah will come as soon as the most unbridled individual of faith becomes possible, meaning that he will come before it exists. He will come when it will, and this unbridled faith, in this individualistic faith, would be this joke, this Jewish joke at describing the Christian faith. That is an unbridled faith compared to the Judaic faith. So, because when Christ is born, that's before it's really organized. I mean, there are the apostles, or I don't know who's around, but it's
But you
so
see,
it would be.
Yeah. But the Messiah. I'm sorry.
And then it's recognized as the Messiah. But when it comes, the faith is not organized, and it's not.
But you see.
And then there's nobody to suffer his coming because they're not.
Okay, but you see, I don't think we have an account here of when Christ came, because what is being assumed is that the Messiah will come in the future, only when certain conditions.
But it
are
would
met.
be a futur antérieur.
I don't think it will be a future anterior, because that would be to assume that Christ is the Messiah. But I think this parable is calling into question whether Christ was the Messiah or should be understood as the Messiah, either historically or through a future anterior. I think
But that would be the Christian doctrine. I mean, according to the Christian doctrine, Christ is the Messiah.
Yes, according to the Christian doctrine, Christ is the Messiah. That's true. But you see,
who continually comes, by the way.
well, hold on 1 second.
Because then he talks about emulation.
Yes, but let's try to think what that second sentence is doing. Remember the first sentence. The Messiah will come as soon as the unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible. Okay, so is it that first the unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible and then the Messiah will come? Or is the Messiah coming in the form of an unbridled individualism of faith? In other words, are they the same coming? Because if the one happens as soon as the other happens, then we don't need one to happen before the other. It's not on the condition that the one has happened first. It seems so bald, wie heißt das auf Deutsch? So bald, as soon as, right? So at the same time, they happen together. So not Christ, but the Messiah will come as soon as that unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible. What does unbridled mean? Well, it seems to be the negating of the what I'm calling the individualism that belongs to faith, right? The letting loose, or the freeing up of that individualism. And why do we think that? Because that is also the same time, right? Messiah will come, unbridled individualism of faith becomes possible. This is the same time when there's no one to destroy this possibility and no one to suffer its destruction. Seems like no one is there. No one's there.
No one is there. No one that will oppose.
No one
to destroy the possibility. I mean, there could be other people, but no one that would. It doesn't say no one. It says no one to destroy and no one to suffer. So there could be people that don't care. That will suffer.
But if messianic destruction takes this world as its object, I mean, what is messianic destruction? right? What does it mean to say, oh, there will be people around who don't suffer messianic destruction? And I know.
But it's a destruction of Messianic or of the possibility? Because it's
no one to
no,
destroy this possibility
and
and no one to suffer its destruction.
So destruction of
The destruction of the
possibility
possibility?
or the destruction of the Messiah destruction?
This is a question.
Yeah, it's a question.
It's a good question.
But isn't this like a Hegelian end of history? Isn't there almost a reference to the end of history? There's no one around to destroy the possibility. The history is complete, not ended. Completed. This would be the...
No, there's a lot of people around at the end of Hegelian history. It's not depopulated. It's not a everybody's in community, where the nations are mediated with the communities, with, a lot of people. Big crowds.
But what I'm saying is, my reading, in the light of what I just heard, is it seems Hegelian in the sense that once history is completed, not that people weren't around, there's no one going to be in the way of letting this Messiah enter.
All right, well, let's keep this question.
And the graves will
Okay,
open.
this is a really good question. Is there no one around at all? Or is there no one around of the sort who would suffer, who would destroy the possibility,
Right.
and no one
No,
around
impede.
of the sort who would suffer the
Right.
destruction of its possibility, or the destruction that belongs to the Messianic proper? Now, I think that we then have that next line, hence the graves will open themselves, okay? Which suggests to me that if the graves are opening themselves, it's because there are no grave diggers and there's no one around to open them.
But they did open, it
They
did
did.
open itself.
They did in Matthew, that's true.
The grave opened itself.
That's right. Which suggests that there might be something in Christianity that suggests that the Messianic can operate without the individual. Right? St. Matthew would be the example. At which point we get, this perhaps is Christian doctrine too. This prediction of when the Messiah will come. This perhaps is Christian doctrine too. Applying as much to it. I don't know what this applying is. But it seems to me that he might be saying, look, there might be a Christian doctrine that claims that the Messiah will come. It might be the Judeo-Christian doctrine that the Messiah will come once we are no longer caught in the individualism that belongs to faith, and precisely when we're able to think outside the category of the individual. But this is why I think what's actually happening in the second paragraph is that to understand the coming of the Messiah means understanding precisely what comes when it is no longer a human requirement, and not within a calendar day, that is to say, not on a day that could be understood as part of any calendar that belongs to chronological time, right? This day following the next day, this day that follows the day before, that follows the day before, that follows the day before. So the Messiah will come once we can understand what? The break with sequential or chronological time. So not the last day of a sequence, of a chronology, but on the very last, which would have to be a time that's outside of chronology and outside of sequence, at which point we're thinking about a time that does not fit within sequential or chronological time in the same way we were asked in the other parables to think about a place or a here that is outside of spatial coordinates as we know them from the empirical world, right? So what's the here that is not spatially located, the Wegfund here that is not located as another here, right? And what's the very last day that cannot be reducible to any day in a chronology of days, in a series of days, in a sequence of days. It would have to be some other sense of the day, the very last which would mean the end of sequence itself, right? A day that is, in some sense, signifying the end of sequence in chronology. And that, by the way, sounds like destruction to me.
Could it be the end of prediction, that you cannot predict it?
Infinity.
Well, I think we have to ask what's going on with prediction here. The statement, the Messiah will come. I think we have to ask about the authority of that and what is actually being enunciated through that predictive claim. I'm sorry, I know you had your hand up.
Yeah, you actually got to what I was going to say with the last and very last. But I did have one question, actually. A quick one was about the Hegelian joke. When I think of mediation in Hegel, I think of the signs of logic where it counterposes immediacy and immediacy. Is that what we're talking about, or is it something completely different?
Well, I don't know. I think that this is purposeful jumble, quite frankly.
Oh, it's not. Oh.
And we could take it very seriously. But if we're talking about the symbolic presentation of the resurrection of the mediator in the single individual, what is being said, I mean, mediation also is what happens between the individual and the divine in the phenomenology of spirit through the figure of the priest, actually, who becomes the individual who mediates between the human community and the divine sphere of laws. Right? But the priest is still a figure, is still an individual. I mean, I can free associate on that, but what is actually it strikes me as a purposefully tortured sense. It's the kind that people put in newspapers as an argument against the humanities or something.
Two comments. One is about perhaps is a Christian doctrine too. I feel the weight here is not about making distinction between Judaism and Christianity, but instead is relating to the concept of the Messiah, which the differences are not that great. I mean, both doctrines are anticipating the end of time when the Messiah will come, either this form or the other. And the other point I would like to make that within Jewish tradition there is discourse regarding the day, the end of days, the time after time, which is actually I think you can see the last paragraph in this context.
I think that's true. Do you want to talk to us more about that?
I don't feel that I know enough, but
okay. But you want to at least mark it.
That I think it's very clearly drawn from that discourse.
Yes. There's also, I think, a kind of wicked joke. I think there's a little wicked Jewish joke in here. In the second paragraph, the Messiah will come only when he's no longer necessary. He will come only on the day after his arrival. It's like, wait a minute, did he arrive? Yeah. And what's interesting about that, after his arrival, after his Ankunft, is that if he arrives, which is to say he arrives at a certain date and time as a human individual, well and good. But that's not the coming of the Messiah, right? So we actually get a distinction between an individual who arrives in a certain space, time, date, and human form, right? And the idea of the Messiah coming. The Messiah comes after the arrival of the Messiah, suggesting that any Messiah that can arrive in human form in a specific day and time is a false Messiah, right? You can't have an individual being that Messiah. So it's only when we're outside of the idea, when we can understand the Messiah not as individual, not as located in space, and not as arriving in chronological time, that he will come. So on the day after his arrival, he will come not on the last day, not within chronology, but on the very last, so outside of chronology and outside of the form of the individual, and I would add outside of spatial location, apparently.
But
yes, but the will come, it's like a pure futurity, right? He will come.
And you refer to it as a joke, but I mean, and after you mentioned about, you know, it being a bit of a jumble,
Yes.
I read it, I'm seeing some cynicism.
Cynicism. Okay.
You know, it's like, we probably have a Hegelian joke and a Jewish joke, but someone does see it as quite cynical. It's like it's sort of cloaked in this reflexive, I don't know, sort of elliptical argument, but yeah, I need cynicism.
I see. Like it's all nonsense because it's all destruction.
Yeah, and it's like, yeah, Messiah?
Messiah, in other words, the Messiah will never come. That's how you read it.
A little bit like
But perhaps the common belief that either Christian or Jewish religious belief that the Messiah will come, we have to wait for him, we are looking for some kind of redemption. But he says that he's actually criticized this view and he's putting on a different concept of this waiting.
I mean, he is acknowledging the Messiah, so right in that, I mean, he's acknowledging, but I still think he can be cynical within that.
Okay, but what's the difference between a radical cynicism that says, great, so the Messiah will come when we're not around and he's not needed and he'll actually never arrive. And it's like the parable saying, well, that's useless. That's not going to get us anywhere. We still have our daily cares and worries and we can't get beyond and there's no redemption, there's no transcendence. Okay, so we could just take that. Or we could say, maybe this is a kind of radical messianic moment in which a certain idea of futurity is opened up. The will come. That holds out for a time beyond time and a place beyond place, even though we cannot conceptualize it with our ideas of time and our ideas of place and our ideas of chronology and our ideas of individualism.
So you're suggesting...
And that would be radically uncynical. It would be almost what? Yes, but without any sense of realization. Without any sense of realizability, right? Because
Just
this
a horizon.
Messiah, or a futural horizon. I think you suggested earlier this might be a kind of an idea of temporality, and it's asserted. It's asserted. The will come. We have to ask.
Will come only when.
Only
so
when.
Whenever there's, for me, it's like if there's a condition, well, you also, you know, it seems quite strong. You know, only when. So in fact, it may not happen. I'm setting up the possibility of it, but.
Not in our time.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. I don't read it like that. I don't read it as though he's suggesting that it will actually come. I think he's almost negated the whole thing.
Well, it's clear that if the Messiah comes, it will not be in the form of a human, and it will not be for the purposes of redemption.
Right.
Which means that we're talking about that which is to come, which is an opening of a futurity that is not claimed, that is not already organized by space-time and individualism in the way that has traditionally organized the discourse on the Messiah.
And I guess it's like, does it become nullified if the Messiah comes for redemption, but if the Messiah is only going to come when it's no longer necessary, and it's not necessary, then doesn't it just nullify it? And so then,
All right, let's think about it. I'll tell you what I really want us to do. I forgot to look at my clock, and I think I probably owe you a
It's
break.
5:30 something.
5:35.
Okay. This is what I want us to do from here, which I think makes the most sense. I'm going to ask us to come back and look at one of Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history so that you can see how the Messianic works in order to interrupt an historical continuum. Okay? And we will then ask ourselves the question of whether the non-anthropocentric notion of the Messianic not only can provide a kind of critical a critical perspective or break with humanism, anthropocentrism, but also with certain ideas of progressive history, and whether Kafka makes more sense or makes a different kind of sense if we look to see what Benjamin is doing here. And I can talk to you a little bit about what they're both reading and what the Kabbalistic background is for some of their thinking, if that interests you. Should we take a break here?